Hello friends, welcome to CEC Gurukul live lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our previous talk on debate on democratization and the classification of system and regimes. Friends, this is the second lecture. In the previous session we discussed on debate on democratization, and today also we are going to talk more and more on the following topic. For the discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Satish Kumar Jha. Dr. Satish Kumar Jha is Associate Professor in Department of Political Science, Aryabhatta College, University of Delhi. He is a dynamic professor and he puts his heart and soul while giving you in-depth knowledge on various topics. We believe that you are going to learn more and more through Dr. Satish Kumar Jha today also. Friends, if you wish to ask questions from our expert, feel free to talk to us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Satish Kumar Jha, once again. Hello, sir. Welcome to the
Thank you, Geetikaji, and good afternoon. In fact, today's lecture is part of two lecture series on the topic debate on democratization, classification of systems and regimes in, in political science and comparative politics in particular. So, in fact, what we discussed in the first part of discussion, I will just recapitulate briefly in order to establish the connect between what we discussed in the last lecture and what we will be discussing today. In fact, we started with this entire discussion with this, posure that why classification, after all, is required in social science and particularly in political science and comparative politics. What is the rationale of classification of systems, governments or regimes as the nomenclature has been changing over the years. Now, one thing we basically discussed that social science cannot try to imitate the method of natural science in terms of experimentation, the laboratory research and so on and so forth, and therefore a discovery of truth, or one can say that basically the attempt to find out the best system, best political arrangement for the society, how to do that, if that is the mandate of social science and political science. At least political science mandate is to find out political arrangement for for the people, for the good of the society. Now, it is largely with this mission that what political scientists have been doing, that they have been using the method of classification, comparison and so on and so forth in order to find out the weaknesses and strength of various systems, various political arrangements, and accordingly they arrive at certain conclusion with some normative judgments, and therefore it becomes a kind of one can say value loaded statement also, that what is best and what is not good, and what is good, what is best, what is not best, what is ignorable, what is basically desirable, and so on and so forth. So, this is something in fact we discussed very elaborately in the first part of the discussion, that comparison and classification to some extent one can say that are substitutes for experimentation and other methods which are used in other branches of knowledge. Now, here I am reminded of Tocqueville, who made a very very perceptive statement when he said that without comparison, in fact, mind does not know how to proceed. In particularly, this statement is applicable to social scientists, that only through comparison mind perhaps starts moving and proceeding. So, therefore, in fact, in the entire classification and comparison is done in order to facilitate evaluation rather than just analysis. And evaluation helps, in order to improve, the functioning of the government, establishment of institutions. So, therefore, it becomes a purposive exercise in order to enable the political community, in order to enable the society to think in terms of improving the state of affairs. So, therefore, a mission is purely normative. The method may be to some extent descriptive. One can say that empirical collects facts from the various models of government and governance, and then they are used for a normative purpose. So, therefore, in fact, this entire exercise of description is tied to this normative judgment, and therefore, what has been happening since ancient time, and this is what we also discussed extensively in the first part of our discussion, that Aristotle, who was who is credited with study of 158 constitutions in order to arrive at his normative judgment that which one is the best, which he said polity is the best, and how did he make that classification. Now, in fact, therefore, this ideal type, construction of ideal type or ideal regime, so to say, in fact, or one can say the utopia building exercise, all these things are tied to this method, be it Plato's Republic, be it Thomas More Utopias, be it Kropotkin's book filled factory and workshop. So all these attempts were basically tied to this method, that is studying, comparing, classifying, evaluating, and then passing a judgment. So therefore, this is something we discussed, that why this classification and comparison are required. Now, of course, one thing we also we have to see that how this method has been fine-tuned over the ages. In fact, initially it was particularly during Aristotle's time, as I discussed, that it was basically in terms of 3-4 system of government, political arrangement about which perhaps the people were familiar. So it was confined to that. For example, in fact, in context of Aristotle's writings, we mentioned that how he made 2 important observations, that any rule has to be evaluated in terms of who is ruling and who is benefiting from that rule. If it is being ruled by a single individual, then he called it tyranny, because and if that rule is in the selfish interest of the ruler. If it is ruled by a small group of people, then it is oligarchy, again if it is interest of a small group. Similarly, if it is ruled by many, but it is not in the interest of all, its common good, then of course he called it democracy. And according to Aristotle, all were the perverted forms of governance. So therefore, in fact, that was his way of classifying things, that who is ruling and in whose interest the rule is basically being done. On the other hand, the similar mechanism, if it is basically the purpose changes, if a rule is by one person but nonetheless it is interest of all, then he called it is not tyranny, it is monarchy. Similarly, if it is rule of a small group but it is interest of the entire society, then it is aristocracy, not oligarchy. Similarly, if the rule of masses, of rule of many and interest of many, he called it polity, not democracy. So therefore, in fact, this perverted and normal form, the kind of distinction he made. Of course, he called tyranny the worst, monarchy and aristocracy good, but not practical, and therefore he basically settled for a kind of system which he called polity, where he believed that it will be a kind of combination, a mixed rule between 2 types of system, that is democracy and aristocracy, where the middle class would rule because they will be neither rich nor poor, so therefore it will be in the common interest. So this is how this entire classification started earlier in ancient time, and we have had discussion on this. But we also mentioned that this set a very important benchmark so far as the political science and the comparative and classification exercise is concerned. But of course, in fact, what happened that later on many modifications were made. This entire political arrangement, the discourse on political arrangement, underwent changes in modern time, and this is how we perhaps referred to Hobbes' Boda, particularly in terms of their discourse on sovereignty, the location of power, and the way they justified absolutism, absolute monarchical rule. And from that we moved to a different discourse, in hands of Locke and Montesquieu, when the entire constitutional democracy, constitutional government was basically idealized and valorized, where basically number of issues were brought into discussion, including limited government, constitutional rule, importance of consent of the people, and natural rights, separation of power, checks and balances. So in fact, all these normative statements, normative positions, normative judgments, along with certain institutional prescriptions. This is why Montesquieu becomes so important for the entire discussion on the government, on the political arrangement, on constitutionalism, and so on and so forth. Because with Montesquieu, Locke initiated, but with Montesquieu we get a very clear blueprint about these ideas. And finally, we also saw that how United States of America, of course, for Montesquieu, the British political system was ideal, but nonetheless it was United States of America which basically put into action all these normative prescriptions of Montesquieu, and to some extent one can say Locke. So therefore, this was the period in modern time. But we also mentioned that when we moved further, this entire classification exercise started changing its color. For example, what happened that when this entire discourse on constitutionalism emerged, when democracy was defined in terms of people's consent, mandate, and number of features which are normally called liberal democratic theory or liberal democratic process, what happened that many scholars started doing this exercise, classifying the system, and therefore what we find that in the process, earlier it was only for example, in ancient time the distinction was often made between democracy, oligarchy, and tyranny. As I mentioned, that Aristotle rule of one, few, and many. On the other hand, we find that by 18th century, this entire discourse shifted to new terrain. And here now, of course, distinctions, were made between monarchy and republic. Distinctions were made between autocratic and the constitutional rule, and this is why perhaps we discussed Boda and Hobbes. Then by later on, of course, further fine tuning was done, and here the institutional niceties of political institutions, the niceties of liberal democratic institutions came into the discussion. Therefore, new modes were basically initiated, particularly in terms of the location of power, distribution of power, and dispersal of power. And so therefore what happens that in scholars started discussing about various types of constitution, various types of the state authority, various types of political institutions. So therefore this entire framework, the reference point underwent changes, and therefore we have had discussion along unitary federal constitutions, unitary and federal systems, state systems. We have had discussion along presidential and parliamentary form of government. We have had discussion on authoritarian and democratic constitutions. So therefore what happened, that this entire framework gradually started getting fine-tuned in the hands of political scientists and great scholars of this comparative exercise. For example, Bryce, Feiner, and many other started doing this type of path-breaking work of classification and and comparison. But one thing we should remember, that all of these were essentially called traditional, institutional, and constitutional approach, which were basically used from 18th century to 20th century. And therefore these traditional approaches were also subjected to rigorous criticism. And therefore we had also mentioned that how behavioral revolution, system approach, structural functional approach emerged as a kind of protest movement against this type of institutional comparison, institutional approach, which they call traditional approach. And it was argued that they didn't take into account the societal dimensions, the cultural dimensions, the interest of the groups, various groups in society, and therefore they wanted to fill that void by bringing new issues, by doing empirical studies, the micro studies. But nonetheless, as we had seen in our earlier discussion, that this behavioral system and structural functional approach, which also innovated a new category, that is system, that political system as a subsystem of larger social system, and around political system, comparative politics and political scientists should arrange their discussion. They should classify, they should compare, and so on and so forth. But of course, there was a context to that, which we'll be turning to, we'll be turning to in a very few minutes. For example, it was a product of 20th century. particularly between interwar period and particularly after the Second World War. And that was also the period of Cold War, ideological rivalry in the world. And therefore, what happened that a kind of attempt was made, as it is alleged, through the system, behavioral and structural functional method to basically take this ideological warfare which was going on between the two ideological camps, one led by communist bloc Soviet Union, another by so-called liberal capitalist bloc of the West, led by United States of America. So this entire exercise, this ideological conflict shifted to this academic intellectual terrain in social science with these methods and these approaches. And therefore, in fact, the system theory was criticized by many people that it was a kind of attempt to privilege, prioritize and idealize a particular form of government or particular process of democratic governance, that is United States of America and Western Europe. And therefore, what happened? The terrain, the one site of contestation was essentially the underdeveloped countries, particularly the newly independent nations of Asia, Africa and Latin America. And both camps were trying to basically elude them to their side, and therefore it was ideological warfare basically being fought on the terrain of these newly independent nations. So that had ideological context also, but nonetheless the system classification was a very important intervention. But along with that, we also saw that a third type of classification started, and it was along the world classification along three worlds: first world, second world and third world. And this was also ideologically loaded, because first world was essentially called the world which had more material development. The second world was also called materially developed and industrialized, but not like the first world, and it was ideologically also anchored into communism and socialism. And the third world was basically called those countries who were newly independent, mostly from the Asian, African and Latin American continents, and therefore they were basically trying to attain material prosperity, and therefore they were called third world countries. So this classification went side by side. But one thing is important to remember, that even this classification, which was essentially done on basis of material growth, or one can say that material prosperity, was not approved by many people, including those who were called the third world countries, because it was believed that it was highly demeaning to call them third world, underdeveloped third world countries, that because many of them might have suffered on account of colonialism, but many of them had a great glorious past in terms of civilizational values. So therefore it was resented. Instead of this third world categorization, what was perhaps considered more sanctimonious, what was considered more dignified, was the underdeveloped world or developing countries or developing world. But nonetheless, this classification also went. So therefore, what we find that ancient time we have had a particular type of classification. Then in modern time it started with altogether on a different note, with three important revolutions: French American War of Independence and the Puritan and the Glorious Revolutions in Britain, and then subsequently many innovations which were made in order to institutionalize democracy. So therefore this classification exercise also started getting fine-tuned and started acquiring new overtone. And therefore these thinkers, Hobbes, Baudin, Locke, Montesquieu and many other, reflected that spirit of their time, that 17th and 18th century. Now what happens, that these evolutions have to be kept in mind so far as this classification and comparisons are concerned, because what we find that today in contemporary times all these classificatory models have basically reached the dead end. They are not being able, or they are not being being able to help us in finding out that what can be the best way of classification and comparison today, particularly when many of these categories are becoming redundant. In fact, third world, second world and first world, second world, third world category became redundant after 1989 revolution in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union. We may call it revolution, or we may call it a process through his entire camp, the ideological camp around communism and socialism disintegrated. So therefore the second world itself disappeared. Now the third world itself became a unsustainable category, particularly after 90s. Because many of these countries who are called third world on basis of their material, poor material prosperity, weak material prosperity, started showing signs of recovery. And therefore what happened, that many of these countries were are today called newly emerging economies. For example, Asian nations, many Asian and Southeast Asian countries who are referred as Asian tigers. In fact, China is another great story of material prosperity. In fact, India, Brazil, South Africa, these are the countries who are today part of the G20 configuration of world powers to take a stock of the global economic political situation, and therefore their voice is basically reaching to the high table of negotiations and decision making. So therefore the countries who were once dubbed as third world countries now are basically part of the high table of global negotiations and power discussion, power mechanism. So therefore this third world category itself is now not sustainable. Second world, as I mentioned, at post 89 they didn't carry much sense. So therefore this three world categorization ran into trouble. The system theory, as we have already discussed, that was put to ruthless criticism. Some of the advocates of this structural, functional and system theory themselves started critiquing it. So and the earlier institutional method, particularly since 18th century, where the constitutions, division of power along unitary, federal and a number of other references were used for classification, also didn't find much favor, because it was argued that they were not being able to reflect on the larger societal process through which democratic ideas are basically practiced, through which the democratic ideas get institutionalized. So therefore these institutional and method and constitutional methods also didn't get much approval. So therefore what has been realized, that all these classificatory exercises on the one hand are very important for political science, for social science, and particularly in this area called comparative politics, but nonetheless they are not, the old traditional approaches are not being are not helping us to basically do what was the purpose behind such approach, which we discussed shortly. So therefore in this context, now this quest for this new method of classification and comparison has started. By 1980s, one can say that entire classification industry went into limbo, and people started abandoning that method because it was not possible to classify along the old lines, be it unitary, federal, constitutional and autocratic, or one can say monarchical and republic. So therefore these things were not helpful at all, and therefore by 1980s this thing was being abandoned. But we find that recently many scholars have started again looking at this classification and comparison through different prism, where of course not a very hard theory of classification is being built the way it was done earlier, but nonetheless a very provisional tentative hypothesis is put forth, and therefore this contemporary classification and comparison, one can call it, is highly provisional. And it is of course considered to be provisional and tentative, but nonetheless it is also argued that they are helpful in understanding the larger process of democratization in the world. So therefore another important thing we should remember here, that earlier in modern period of time, when this classification and comparison were done, the reference point was either the institutional growth, institutional maturity, or material prosperity. But in contemporary time, the reference point has also changed. Now, the reference point is the level of democratization. That what is the level of democratization? And therefore, it is ultimately this classification and comparison exercises are done in the terrain of democracy and democratization and democratic process. That what is the level of democratization? And here, not only institutional, maturity, not only institutional, maturity and their health are basically the concern, but also number of other yardsticks are used, and those yardsticks are equally important. For example, who is basically ruling? The questions often is referred that who is ruling. That is basically, who rules in terms of the political participation in the society, the nature of political participation. Then, of course, the reference is also nature of compliance. That what is the nature of compliance? Where this compliance of the people is secured through force or threat, or it is through compromises and negotiations and bargaining, which is basically hallmark of a liberal model of politics. Similarly, the reference is also made to the fact that whether government is centralized or fragmented. What is the basically level of checks and balances within the system. Then, of course, the governmental power, whether it is acquired or it is basically transferred. For in terms of the regime, nature of regime, whether it is open, whether it is competitive or the monolithic. Similarly, the balance between the state authority and individual rights. This is a very important reference point, that what type of constitutional rights are guaranteed to the people. What is basically the level of state's intervention in the private sphere of citizens' life. So therefore, this balance is also seen as a reference point for categorization, classification and comparison. Then, of course, material development is not altogether absent from the exercise of classification and comparison, but material development is not the sole criterion, the way it was the case earlier when the first world, second world and third world categorization was done. And along with this, of course, along with this material development, another important reference point in contemporary classification is basically role of market and planning, because the planning is associated with erstwhile the socialist bloc, the communist bloc, as well as many third world countries including India, which had a planned development, and of course the quest for social democracy. On the other hand, the market, which is considered to be the hallmark of liberal democratic societies. So therefore, this present attempt to classify and comparison is also done along this line. The nature of of economic organization of society, whether it is through market or it is through centralized planning. And finally, of course, stability of regime is also taken into account, that how stable regime is, because of course stability becomes important in an unstable society, in a crisis-ridden society. In fact, this democratization also remains short-lived. We have seen many countries where the process of democratization starts, but it doesn't last long. So therefore, stability of the regime is also are considered. So therefore, these are some of the parameters which are being used today to classify the various processes of democratization, if one calls it, because the classification along government, classification along world, first, second, third world, as we saw, the classification around systems, all these things are today considered not desirable. So therefore, the parameters which are being laid to see the process of democratization. So ultimately what we find, that democracy is basically the yardstick to to measure the level of change, the level of transition, transformation, and also the nature of government and governance. So therefore, this entire exercise is being done in the terrain of democracy, which was not the case earlier. Though in fact we should remember, as I mentioned, that earlier mode of classification which started in 17th and 18th century, be it Hobbes, be it Baudin or Locke and Montesquieu, particularly Montesquieu and Locke, they basically reflected that spirit of the age. That was basically the democratic spirit of the age, when basically power was being transferred from monarch to the parliament, and therefore number of institutions, mechanisms were discussed in order to make people's control on the government more effective. So democracy was definitely in the backdrop of all these method of classification, but nonetheless the democracy itself as an idea has been undergoing changes, and in the contemporary times when I mentioned these parameters, some of these parameters were perhaps not used in earlier attempt at classification. These parameters are considered to be the new uses in terms of classification and comparison. Now, one thing we should remember before I proceed further, that there are many criticisms also for this classification exercise, which to some extent I also touched in my earlier lecture, the first part of the lecture. In fact, there is a considered, some of them call that there is an attempt for oversimplifying things through this comparison and classification. Then of course it is also alleged that the differences among various types of political arrangements are ignored. Then of course the charge of ethnocentrism is very grave, which is basically nothing but Eurocentrism. That the experience of Europe, experience of few societies are universalized, and they are basically insulated from the various cultural contexts under which the governments function, the politics is done, and the society operates. So therefore it is insulated from the cultural context, and therefore it is abstracted from a particular historical, social, cultural experience, and that is considered to be the ideal type. So therefore this charge of ethnocentrism, and in other words one can say Eurocentrism, is a very grave so far as this entire classification and comparison is done. And then of course for example Southeast Asia, Japan is totally different in terms of the cultural experiences, even if they have also attained industrial growth. Even if if you look at in terms of the role of the state, the way state functions in these Asian countries is different from the way a state is visualized as an entity in economic process in the Western discourse, Western societies, because of the cultural context. But these things were ignored for long, and therefore this value bias in this entire approach and method of classification and comparison which was there in comparative politics at times is basically highlighted, that these value biases intrude into their discussion, into their analysis and in classification. And therefore in fact it is argued that in recent times with the beginning of this globalization, when altogether new dimensions have emerged, in fact have posed new challenges, and the earlier weaknesses were already there, but these new challenges have also exposed the earlier method, earlier approach and earlier attempt. So therefore in fact this sensitivity about the limitations and weaknesses of the earlier methods have basically enabled the political scientists to think in terms of the new method, new approach at classification and comparison. And therefore we find that in contemporary times, particularly since 80s, or one can say especially since 90s, a new mode of classification has basically appeared on the intellectual horizon. And today neither they are seen purely through the prism of institutions, constitutions, material prosperity, rather they are combined together in number of factors. In fact, in the sense that both cultural, economic, political factors are interlocked in their analysis, and therefore the most important emphasis is put on the cultural context, which to some extent one can say that was also done during this structural, functional and system analysis period. But nonetheless because of their overemphasis on other factors, the quest for scienticism and factualism, hyperfactualism and empiricism, these things basically didn't contribute much. So therefore the present attempt is a very noble attempt, one can say, that where political scientists are not number one going for a hard theorization and hard classification. Number 2, they are keeping it tentative and provisional. And number 3, they are interlocking political, economic and cultural factors in their analysis, and thereby they are trying to put forth a hypothesis, or one can say a kind of framework, or a tentative framework of parameters around which the various types of government in the world can be evaluated, studied, compared and classified. And here we find that on basis of those parameters we have just mentioned, they feel that the 5 different types of regimes today can be identified. And here one thing is very important, that neither the system is used, nor world is used, nor government is used, rather the preference is given for a new term, not a new term, but it was always there, but has acquired new meaning, that is basically regime. And these 5 types of regimes are identified as the Western polyarchy. Number 2, we'll also see that why the word polyarchy is used, because in many senses this Western polyarchy, as they are called, is similar to what is normally known as liberal democratic system. But nonetheless, there is a meaning behind this usage of the term polyarchy, Western polyarchy. And then new democracies, and then of course the third is East Asian regimes, which do not fit into either new democracies or Western polyarchy. And then the fourth is Islamic region, particularly the kind of churning which is taking place in West Asia, in Middle East, in many countries who are basically trying to govern their societies through Islamic precepts, Quranic precepts, particularly after the rise of political Islam. So therefore the fourth categorization is the Islamic region, and the fifth is the military regimes. In spite of massive democratization in the world today, still there are many countries which are reeling under military regimes. That is the fifth categorization, and therefore it is argued that these 5 types, one can say 5 types of regimes today help us to understand what type of a world we live in, what type of political arrangement exists in different parts of the world. And here in these 5 types, as I mentioned, the parameters they use, the focus is essentially on 2 important factors, the level and nature of democratization. And democratization here understood in different terms than what was perhaps understood in 18th and 19th century in the West, slightly taking it away from its institutional frame to the people's people and citizens and the civil society discourse. So therefore the level of democratization along with the cultural frame particularly under which many of these democracies are today operating, and therefore it is an attempt to take it away from the earlier Eurocentrism which characterized the earlier characterization. So therefore this is a new attempt today. We find that largely different from the earlier attempts which were in 20th century ideological in nature. During Cold War, as we mentioned, the 3 worlds, or structural functional, or the system theory which talked about the political systems, that was also ideologically motivated. And the earlier was the product of a historic time, historic period, historic moment, that is after revolutions, the liberal bourgeois revolutions, be it France, Britain or United States of America, and they had their own contribution to make. But of course all those classifications are not today much useful. So it is in this light that we find that the new contemporary attempt is being initiated to understand the 5 different types of regimes in the world. Now we will turn to this this regime type, because one thing is important here, that one realization which I mentioned that happened, that the third world countries who were once called third world countries, be it the Gulf countries, be it many Asian and Southeast Asian countries, be it some Latin American countries like Brazil, or one can say that Asian country like India. In fact, China also, after 1978 economic reform, they have simply falsified the earlier theory, earlier prognosis, earlier hypothesis, and earlier classification. Because of material prosperity, in many of these countries, the level and the nature of democratization, like India and even Japan, one can say post 45, so therefore now it is a requirement of the time that they should have a different frame to look at this entire system of political arrangement prevalent and in operation in the different parts of the world. And therefore, as I mentioned, that democratization has become a very important reference point to do this such a study and analysis. And it is here, in fact, I am reminded of Huntington's 3 waves of democracy, which is very important, or one can say very helpful here to understand these 5 different typologies which are basically drawn by a scholar. And Huntington, in fact, when he talks about waves of democracy, he talks of waves, particularly 3 important waves. The first wave, he call it, is from 1828 to 1926. And that is the period in which, that is the wave in which he puts USA, France, and Britain, the 3 basically epicenters of a liberal democratic churning, where basically democratization happened. So, Huntington calls it the first wave. Then for him, the second wave is from 1943 to 1962. And here, basically the post-Second World War, essentially. And here he puts West Germany, Italy, Japan, and post-independent India. So this is a part of the second wave. And then, of course, he also talks of the third wave, and the third wave is basically the wave which has started since mid-74, particularly after many erstwhile dictatorships, military dictatorship, turned into democracy. And here, in fact, mostly the Latin American and some other countries, in fact, he also puts into this category. But of course, there is a fourth wave also, and the fourth wave one can see particularly after Arab Spring in the West Asian region. So this is how, in fact, we have to see that waves of democracy, as the discussion was initiated by Huntington, to some extent is useful. But of course, Huntington's entire frame is also value loaded, because along with his wave of democracy, he is also talking about class of civilizations, particularly in terms of his value preferences between the Western liberal model and some other models, particularly the Islamic model, which is basically the fourth type of categorization in the hands of contemporary scholars, as a kind of resistance, as a challenge to this democratization. But then the scholars argue that by using the frame of the Western model, by using the cultural frame of the West, scholars like Huntington, they are not being able to make sense of the process of democratization in these countries, which are culture anchored into their own culture, into their religion, into the specificity of their societies. And therefore it is argued that this class of civilization itself is a very value loaded proposition. So therefore, in fact, Huntington writings may have this ideological overtone, value preferences, but nonetheless this discussion of wave of democracy is often referred to as very useful in terms of making sense of this contemporary mode of classification. Now, starting with these 5 regime types, which are basically led on by the contemporary scholarship. The first is the Western polyarchy. In fact, I mentioned earlier that why polyarchy? Why not call it Western liberal democracy? Because they resemble to great extent with the liberal democratic model. But then, of course, because in this Western polyarchy, the countries which are added are North America, Western Europe, and Australia. And most of them, in fact, are the product of this liberal democratic churning. But those scholars who prefer polyarchy instead of liberal democracy, basically the reasons which are cited for the preference for this word polyarchy are twofold. Number one, that the liberal usage is often considered to be normative and value loaded as political ideal, and therefore this liberal, if you avoid this word liberal, it slightly becomes more useful in terms of making sense of the democratization and democratic process. And therefore, another argument is that the polyarchy suggests that they are still sort of the goal of democracy in some respects. They are also not foolproof. It cannot be said that there is nothing which is desirable there in terms of on the scale of democracy. So therefore, the polyarchy is more in fact useful uses in contemporary parlance so far as these 5 typologies are concerned. Now, of course, this polyarchy has a genealogy. In fact, it is not the first time that the contemporary scholars have started using. In political science, as we are familiar, that for the first time the term polyarchy was used by Dahl and Lindblom, particularly Dahl in his writing Polyarchy, Participation and Opposition, and Lindblom in his book Politics, Economics and Welfare. So therefore, polyarchy is a very familiar term in political science, but nonetheless, what has happened that with this new usage, it has acquired a new overtone. Now, of course, there are 2 features of this polyarchy model of the classification. The first, there is a high tolerance for opposition. That means there is open and free competition, there is a civil liberty for the people, the civil society is quite vibrant, and another feature is that there is ample opportunity for participation of the people through popular responsiveness, a very free and fair electoral system. So therefore, this is perhaps considered to be the signpost of this polyarchic, the polyarchic regimes today, that is Western polyarchy. Now, of course, one thing is important to remember here, that this polyarchy, the Western polyarchy is used to characterize large number of countries in the world, and these countries sometimes are basically also internally differentiated in terms of the nature of the control mechanism, the nature of the people's participation, nature of the state machinery, particularly in terms of decision making, and most importantly power sharing. So therefore, within this Western polyarchy, the 2 important distinctions are very apparent. The one is between the centralized and majoritarian systems, that is mostly the British parliamentary system, and which has its reverberations in many Commonwealth countries like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and also, of course, one can also add India. And other is basically more fragmented and the pluralist model within this Western polyarchy. And here, in fact, the focus is on consensus and power sharing. And this within majority democracy, it is argued that basically the system of government is mostly along parliamentary lines, and as I mentioned, that UK, Netherlands, Australia, Canada, and Israel and India, these are the countries which are considered to be majoritarian and centralized polity. Whereas the consensual model is basically referred with reference to United States of America as a pioneer in terms of this second model, which is basically built around the idea of consensus and fragmentation of power, diffusion of power, and both in terms of the governmental institutions as well as societal arrangement, and they are in real sense pluralist democracy. Now this continental Europe is considered to be a variation of this consensual model so far as this Western polyarchy is concerned. And this continental Europe, basically it is argued that the consensus in polity and in society is underpinned by party system, and here in fact the bargaining and power sharing are highly institutionalized. And of course, the countries which are basically put under this category are Belgium, Austria and Switzerland, which are considered to be constitutional democracy within these polyarchic regimes. So therefore, within this Western polyarchy, a distinction is made between the centralized and the majoritarian system and the consensual and the constitutional regimes, that is continental Europe, along it to some extent United States of America. So therefore here this theory of constitutionalism, which has been put forth by Leffert, a very eminent political scientist in recent years, is coming handy in order to evaluate and study the Western polyarchies with some features of this constitutional democracy. Feature like coalition government, separation of power, bicameralism, multi-party system, proportional representation system, federalism, Bill of Rights, and codified constitution. These are considered the hallmark of these constitutional democracies. But one thing is to be remembered, that unlike the earlier classification and comparisons, scholars basically desist from going for hard classification and hard theorization, because they also argue that every regime within even this Western polyarchy and within this majoritarian and consensual system, consensual system, are exceptional. For example, United States of America is exceptional in many respects. For example, it never experienced a feudal system, and no socialist party has ever grown in United States of America. And similarly, other countries are also exceptional. So therefore, they cannot be put under the same category, and they cannot be basically yoked under the same frame. And this is how they basically make a space for open-ended classification, even if a broad categorization they do under Western polyarchic regimes. In India, in the case of India, the scholars face little bit problem. On the one hand, the system is majoritarian, on pattern of the British system or the Commonwealth model of constitutionalism, as it is often referred, which is similar to Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But in many respects, it is argued that in recent years, after the decline of one party dominance, particularly after the decline of Congress, it is argued that the polity is again heading toward the consensual method, constitutional democracy or the consensual democracy. So this debate goes on the India. Of course, there are the second category is the new democracies, and here it comes under third wave of Huntington, which began after 1974, and particularly overthrow of the right-wing dictatorship, Greece, Portugal, Spain, retreat of army generals in Latin America, and fall of communism. So therefore, 1973 only 40% of countries were electoral democracy. By 2003, it is argued that 63% of states out of 153 have become democratic. So many of them are transitional democracies, particularly Eastern Europe, in light of shock therapy by the IMF and the kind of ethnic and other identities which have basically surfaced, and the kind of disintegration we have seen of Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. These new democracies are highly transitional in nature. There is no final word on the nature of this democracy, that how stable they are, but still coping up with this process of democratization. And then the fourth classification is the East Asian regimes, about which we are referring, the economic process of industrialization, South Korea, Taiwan, Hungary, Singapore, Malaysia. Many of these countries are Asian tigers, including Japan, and therefore they have a combination of state and market, some sort of structuring or anchoring into their cultural milieu. And the fourth is the Islamic regimes, that is basically mostly the countries which are moving in they are governed by theocratic regimes, at the precepts of Quranic laws and so on and so forth, the political Islam as we are referring to. And here of course the difference is made between fundamentalism and the pluralist tradition within these Islamic regimes. And finally the military regimes which keep surfacing, be it Pakistan, be it Nigeria, be it Indonesia. Military regimes are replaced by democratic regimes, and again they go back to the military regimes. So these are the 5 different categorizations which we find taking place today in order to classify and compare various regimes in the world in order to see the process of democratization.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so much for giving us this session. Friends, you are requested to write to us at info.cec@nic.in. This is the ID where you can post your questions as well your feedback. We are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.